Chapter 18. Jan was ready by 6:30 p.m. and waiting in the living room for Chris to arrive. She'd fed Tinder, showered, washed her hair and spent some time trying to decide what to wear. It was the first time since she'd come to live in Ivy Cottage that she'd needed to change out of jeans and a jumper. She was now wearing a dress, one of 3 she'd packed in case she needed to look smart. DC Matt Davis had been very helpful and thorough when he'd visited that afternoon. Not only had he checked the back garden, but he'd gone into the woods surrounding the cottage and down the lane where she'd seen the shadowy figure running from the front door and between the trees. He hadn't found any signs of anyone living in the woods and suggested it might have been an animal she'd seen. She hadn't told him otherwise. She would wait until she had some firm evidence. He suggested again that she went for a walk in Coleshaw Woods at the back of the cottage, and she was considering it. Here she was, living in a renowned beauty spot, and she'd hardly explored it at all. At 7 p.m, Jan heard Chris's car pull up outside. Tinder had heard it too and pricked up his ears. "See you later," she said, standing, and ruffled his fur. She shut him in the living room so he couldn't get upstairs, and then went into the hall where she put on her coat. Leaving the hall light on so she could see when she returned, Jan opened the front door. Chris was turning his car around as Wood Lane was a dead end. The only light came from his car's headlamps. She waited until he'd completed the turn and then went round to the passenger side. "Hi," she said brightly, getting in. Immediately she sensed an atmosphere. "Hello," Chris said, his voice flat. He tried to smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Perhaps he'd changed his mind about taking her out after all. "Are you okay?" she asked, pausing before fastening her seatbelt. "Yes, thanks. Are you?" He slipped the car into first gear and pulled away. "I've had a busy day," she said, making conversation. "I boarded up the hole in the hedge again, took Tinder to the village, and then had a visit from the police." She had expected Chris to be surprised by the mention of the police, but he wasn't. "I know," he said, concentrating on the road ahead. DC Matt Davis was the officer you saw. Not sure why it merited CID. He stopped off at the village store after he'd been to see you. He knows Lillian and my brother." "Oh, of course. I should have guessed," Jan said with a smile. Everyone knew everyone else here. But there was an awkward silence. "Have you had a good day?" she asked. "It was okay. I was working locally. But Jan, I don't understand why you involved the police. I thought we'd agreed it wasn't necessary." She looked at him again, but his face was expressionless. "I just felt it was wise to report it," she said. "Why does it matter? What's the problem?" "No problem. But news travels fast round here." "So? Matt didn't find anything?" "He wouldn't. Not during the day." "So he might have found something if he'd come at night?" she asked with a stab of unease. "I mean, you only have the problem at night, don't you?" "Mostly, although I'm sure I saw someone today when I walked into the village." Chris didn't reply, but stared straight ahead, apparently concentrating on the uneven road surface. Jan wished she hadn't come. The evening was already a disaster, and it had hardly begun. She was about to make an excuse to return home when Chris turned to her. "I'm sorry," he said. "I can be a moody bugger sometimes. Let's start the evening again, shall we? I've booked us a table at a really nice restaurant." "Yes, I know," she said, relieved. "You do? How?" "Lillian told me. News travels fast round here." "Touché," he said, and this time his smile did reach his eyes. Chapter 19. At the same time as Jan and Chris were being shown to a candlelit table in Bon Appetit, a fine dining restaurant in Coleshaw, Emma and Ian were sitting at their kitchen table, having just eaten egg on toast. It was all they'd wanted, as neither of them was hungry. Ian had cooked it. He was calmer and more reasonable now. He could see why Emma hadn't ever told him she'd been conceived using donor sperm. Quite simply, it hadn't mattered to her. The man who had brought her up was her father, and that was that. Emma, for her part, now accepted that in order for Ian to continue his research into their genetic history, which was important to him, he needed to know who the donor was. She had agreed in principle to finding out, but was reluctant to take the first step, to ask her mother for the details of the clinic they'd used. Emma knew she'd be upset. "Phone her rather than go there again," Ian said. "It will be easier than facing her in person." "I might," Emma said, nervously fiddling with her fork. "Or I could phone her?" Ian offered. "No, I should. But I know it's going to upset her again." "It might not. I mean, you've already told her why I need the information, to trace our genetic history. It's not such a big step for her to realize we need the details of the donor." "I think she's hoping we'll forget about it and you won't continue with your research and just let the matter go." "Emma," Ian said, reaching for her hand, "I thought we'd agreed we needed to know, whatever the outcome." She gave a small nod and slid her hand away. "Let's phone her now," Ian said enthusiastically. "It'll be easier for you if I'm here. If you get upset, I can take over and speak to her." "No, Dad will be there. Mum won't discuss it in front of him. She won't have told him I've been asking about the donor. It's never mentioned in my family." "Okay, so phone and ask her to call you back." "All we want is the name of the clinic, and I can do the rest. Please, Emma. It's better to do it now and get it out the way, or you won't sleep tonight." "All right," Emma said. Ian left the table and fetched Emma's phone. Handing it to her, he sat opposite and watched as she pressed the number for her parents' landline. They preferred using the landline to their mobiles if they were at home. A few rings and her father answered. Emma's heart sank. "Hello, Dad. How are you?" she asked, immediately feeling deceitful. "I'm good, thanks, pet. How are you?" "Not too bad." "It's lovely to hear from you. Your mother said you'd stop by. Now, you're feeling a bit better. Why don't you and Ian come over for some dinner at the weekend? I'll do your favourite curry with my speciality rice." "Thanks, Dad. That would be great." She felt another stab of guilt. "Good. Everything okay with you?" "Yes." "Did you want to speak to your mother?" he asked guilelessly. Emma felt even more guilty. "Yes, please, Dad." "I'll put her on. Love you, pet." "Love you too, Dad." She met Ian's gaze, and he nodded encouragingly. A moment later, her mother came on the phone. "Hi, love. Everything all right?" "Yes, thanks. Is Dad still in the room?" "No, he's gone to check on our dinner. Why?" "Ian's here with me. He needs to know the name of the clinic. You know, the one we talked about." There was silence before Mary said in a whisper, "I can't discuss it now. Your father may hear me." "All I need is the name of the clinic, and Ian will do the rest." She waited. More silence. "It's not going to go away, Mum. Not until Ian's found out. Dad need never know. I promise you." "No good will come of this," Mary said. "Please, Mum, just tell me." "I will, but don't say I didn't warn you. It was called The Moller Clinic. Thank you. But already the line was dead. There, I knew she'd be upset, Emma said angrily. Did she tell you the name of the clinic? Ian asked. Yes, the Moller Clinic. Did she say where it was? No, and I'm not going to ask her any more about it. Never mind, there shouldn't be too many clinics with that name. Opening his laptop, Ian began tapping the keys. Emma watched him for a moment and then stood. I'm going to bed. I've got a headache. But Ian was too engrossed in what he was doing to reply or even look up. Emma left the table, regretting she'd agreed to make the call. Her mother was right. No good would come of it. Just the opposite, in fact. Chapter 20. Although the evening hadn't started well, it had dramatically improved after Chris had apologised for being moody. Jan was pleased she hadn't asked to return home. The restaurant was really nice. The sort of place she'd only have booked for a special occasion. Chris had clearly made an effort to impress her, which Jan appreciated. Gone were the trainers, jeans and zip-up windbreaker jacket. He was now dressed smart casual in beige chinos, cotton shirt, navy blazer and brown leather shoes. As they'd entered the restaurant, he'd complimented her on her appearance. You look lovely. And Jan had felt a warm frisson of anticipation for the evening ahead. He was being very attentive, refilling her glass and checking her food had been cooked to her liking. Their conversation flowed and became easier with every glass of wine. Chris had ordered a bottle of Merlot, having first checked with her that she liked red wine. She did, and they discovered they had similar tastes in wine as they did in coffee. He was sipping his wine slowly because he was driving, so Jan was drinking far more than him. It was many months since she'd had more than one glass of wine in an evening, and she knew she was talking a lot. But Chris didn't seem to mind. He was encouraging her, nodding in agreement and laughing at her jokes. She was making the most of it, as on many days recently she hadn't had anyone to talk to apart from Tinder. They'd finished the main course, and the waiter had cleared away their plates and left the dessert menu. Neither of them had looked at it yet, as they were too busy talking. Jan was now entertaining Chris with tales of Tinder's antics. He could be so naughty at times, she said, taking another sip of wine. Why, what's he done now? Chris asked, smiling encouragingly. His latest mischief was in the spare bedroom, you know, where Camille has stored the boxes of her belongings. I couldn't have closed the door properly because this morning he came downstairs, guilt written all over his face, carrying a little white booty in his mouth. I knew it wasn't mine, she laughed. So I went upstairs and found Camille's belongings all over the floor. Perhaps he was missing her and could smell her on them. I don't know. I've repacked them, but I couldn't really tell him off because he gave me one of those adoring looks, the picture of innocence. Glass in hand, Jan paused, expecting Chris to be laughing as he had been doing at her other anecdotal stories, but he wasn't. What sort of booty? He asked. Like a baby's or a large doll's, Jan said. I put it back with the other one and a little matching outfit. Chris paused. Was there anything else in the box? He asked, his expression serious. Just a photograph album. I've repacked everything. I'll make sure Tinder doesn't get in there again. But Chris was looking at her somberly, pensive and deep in thought. Their conversations seemed to have dried up, although Jan didn't know why. He was frowning now. Why? What was he thinking about? She finished her glass of wine. Dogs can be mischievous, she added. Yes, I suppose they can. Make sure the door to the bedroom is kept closed in future. Camille would be upset if she knew Tinder had got in there and destroyed her personal items. He didn't destroy them, Jan said, slightly affronted. He didn't do any real damage. I'm sorry it happened, and I'll tell Camille. I'm not sure what else I can do. Chris nodded, placed his napkin on the table and said, As we finished, I'll get the bill. Without waiting for Jan's reply, he raised his hand and signalled to the waiter. The bill, please, he said, not meeting her gaze. Yes, sir. Would you like a coffee? No, thank you. He was already taking out his wallet. I'll pay my half, Jan offered. No, I asked you out. I'll pay. She watched him settle the bill with no idea what she'd done wrong or how to put it right. Why should he be so worried about Tinder getting into Camille's spare bedroom? The dog hadn't done any real harm. Perhaps there were things in there he didn't want her to see. The photograph album of their last holiday? But she hadn't admitted to looking at that, thank goodness. They stood and walked towards the exit in silence. She could have kicked herself for telling him Tinder had gone into the spare room. The wine had loosened her tongue, but she hadn't seen any reason not to mention it. She still didn't. She walked beside him to his car, and they got in. Chris, have I done something wrong? She asked as he started the engine. Nope. So why have you gone all quiet on me? I hadn't realised I had, he said dourly, and starting the engine he pulled out of the car park. I can get a cab if you like, Jan offered. No, I'll take you home. And that was all he said for a long time. Chapter 21. It had been easy for Ian to find the Moller Clinic on the internet. There was only one listed with that name in the UK. It was situated in a small village on the other side of Coleshaw, about a 30-minute drive away. A well-established fertility clinic, the tagline read. Set up by Carsten and Edie Moller 30 years ago, and offering a sensitive and personalised service. There was a photograph of the couple standing outside their clinic, as if welcoming in their clients. A homely couple in their 60s with greying hair. The clinic itself appeared to be an extension built on the side of what Ian assumed to be their house, but with its own front door. The pictures of the inside of the clinic were like many other private clinics, showing a comfortable waiting area and a consultation and treatment room. By 9 p.m, Ian had read all the information on every page of the Moller Clinic's website, including a whole page of testimonials, some with pictures of babies. The clinic, he'd learnt, specialised in intrauterine insemination, IUI. This involved placing donated sperm inside a woman's uterus using a cannula, where it would hopefully fertilise one of her eggs. The clinic treated heterosexual couples, lesbians and single women. All donated sperm was screened for sexually transmitted and genetically inherited diseases, just as Emma's mother had said. The clinic's mission statement was that treatment should be available to anyone who needed it. Because they were only a small clinic specialising in IUI, they could keep their costs down. Ian was surprised just how little they charged. £300, much less than most other clinics. There was a warning that often more than one treatment was required, but payments could be spread. The couple also offered counselling, with a note stating that clients should be aware that in the UK, children born as a result of donor sperm had the right to know the donor's identity once they reached 18. It was all very reassuring and efficient, Ian thought, and he was hopeful his questions would be answered satisfactorily. After all, Emma had a right to know about her donor. He entered the clinic's number in his phone. He'd call first thing in the morning, as soon as they opened. Even the contact page of their website was reassuring, with its pledge that Edie Moller personally answered all inquiries. Having read all the pages on the Moller Clinic's website, Ian began clicking on other links where the clinic was mentioned. There were reviews praising Carsten and Edie Moller for their wonderful treatment and thanking them for the gift of their child. Ian only found one negative review. "Don't go anywhere near this place. They're in it for their own selfish ends. Miss L." Ian dismissed it. There were always one or two negative reviews. The Mollers certainly weren't in it for the money, as they charged so little, so selfish ends didn't really make sense. Perhaps the poor woman hadn't been able to conceive using their treatment, in which case it wasn't the clinic's fault. They warned the treatment didn't always work. Ian finally closed his laptop, sat back in the chair and stretched. It had been a productive evening. He would have liked to share what he'd found out with Emma, but she had had an early night. He was sorry he had upset her. He seemed to be doing that a lot recently. And then he struggled to find the words to put it right. They'd both been through a lot, and he hoped that once he had the answers to his questions, it would make amends and put their lives back on track. Chapter 22. The silence in the car was unsettling, and Jan was relieved when they turned into Wood Lane. Nearly home, she thought. Moody bugger. 1 minute Chris had been all over her, and the next he was sullen and uncommunicative. And all because Tinder had rearranged some of Camille's belongings. Sitting upright in her seat, Jan kept her gaze straight ahead as they continued along the potholed road surface of Wood Lane. The car's headlamps were the only light, on full beam and illuminating the road ahead. The brightness of the lights seemed to emphasize the darkness of the woods either side, making them even more unnerving, Jan thought. Although she was inside a car, she didn't feel especially safe surrounded by the dark woods, and with Chris beside her not saying a word. She realized she barely knew him. The last bend in the lane appeared, and Jan took out her front door key, ready. She wouldn't ask Chris in for coffee, but she supposed she should thank him. She'd just say a quick formal thank you as she got out of the car, and that would be it. She doubted she'd see him again. They turned the bend and the car's headlights picked up an outline of the cottage. But as they did, something shot out of the front garden, across the lane, and disappeared into the woods. "There!" Jan cried. "Did you see it?" She thought he had, as his gaze had momentarily tracked its movements. "No. What?" Chris asked, looking ahead again. That shadow, that person, you must have seen it." "Nope." He continued to drive steadily towards the cottage. Jan's heart was racing and her mouth had gone dry. She looked all around, but there was nothing to be seen in the lane or woods now. She was sure Chris had seen it. It was the same figure she'd seen earlier when she'd returned from the village. It had been in the front garden then, just as it had now. Whatever it was seemed to be getting braver. Jan shuddered. Chris stopped the car outside the cottage but left the engine running. There was nothing in the front garden, and as far as Jan could see, nothing in the surrounding woods either. She gingerly opened her car door, ready to get out. As she did, Chris turned in his seat, and for a moment she thought he was going to apologize. But his voice was flat, and his face was set and serious when he spoke. "Jan, if you're so nervous about living in the cottage, why don't you move out? I can speak to Camille if you like. She won't keep you in the tenancy if you want to go." "No, thank you," Jan said tersely. "I'm fine," and got out. She closed the car door with more force than was necessary, and went up to the cottage. The car remained stationary for a moment, and then Chris began a 3-point turn. As she let herself in, he completed the manoeuvre and began along the lane towards the village.
"I'll speak to Camille if you like."
She kicked off her shoes. No, thank you. Jan thought, annoyed. I'm not nervous, although you'll probably tell Camille anyway. And you did see something run from the cottage and disappear into the woods. I'm sure of it. But for some reason you're denying it. I don't know what's going on here, but I'm not giving up that easily. I'm staying for now, thank you. Shh, Tinder! She shouted, going down the hall. He was barking furiously from the living room where she'd shut him in. She opened the door and he shot out past her, straight to the front door, still barking. He began frantically scratching to be let out. He knew there'd been something out there. How she would have liked to let him out and then follow with a torch, but she wasn't brave enough for that. Nowhere near. Whoever, whatever was out there, had started coming to the front door. But why? What did they want from her? Food? Or were they coming for her? Chapter 23. The following morning at 8:30 a.m, Ian parked his car in the firm's car park, took out his mobile phone and called the Moller Clinic. Their website said they opened at 8:30, and true to their word, Edie Moller answered in a kind, motherly tone. Good morning. The Moller Clinic. Edie speaking. How can we help you?
"I'd like to discuss donor identification, please, for my wife, Emma Jennings. I'm her husband, Ian Jennings."
Yes, of course. Just give me a moment. I haven't been in the office long, so bear with me while I power up my computer. Then I'll need to find your file. Of course, Ian said, and waited. When we first started our clinic, it was all paper files, Edie said, making conversation as her computer booted. Now we have to store everything digitally. How things have changed. Yes, indeed, Ian agreed, while thinking that modern technology had probably been quite challenging for Mr. and Mrs. Moller, a couple in their 60s. Jennings, Edie said as she searched the files. Ah, yes, here we are. Thank you for your patience. Were you inquiring about yourself or your wife? My wife, Ian said, then stopped. Sorry, I don't understand. My wife's mother had the treatment, so surely it would be listed under Emma's maiden name? Jennings is her married name, my name. And we haven't been to your clinic. Ian paused as his thoughts raced. I really can't imagine why you would have my details. There was silence before Edie said, I'm sorry, my mistake. What was your wife's maiden name? But you found something for Jennings, didn't you? It's a common name. I made a mistake. As it's your wife who is interested in tracing her donor, she will need to contact the clinic. Confidentiality. I'm sure you understand. Ian paused. But just now you were willing to talk to me. That was before, when I thought the inquiry was about you. So you have got something on me, he persisted. As I said, it's a common name and I made a mistake. Please advise your wife to contact the clinic if she wishes to make an inquiry about her donor. Thank you for calling. Saying a quick goodbye, Edie Moller ended the call. Ian stared through the windscreen, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Edie Moller's manner had abruptly changed and become very formal and guarded, quite brusque. Very different to when she'd answered the phone. Had she made a genuine mistake? Jennings was a fairly common surname, Ian supposed. As the clinic had been running for 30 years, there could easily be another Mr. and Mrs. Jennings on file. Except he'd given their forenames too. Emma Jennings, I'm her husband, Ian Jennings, he'd said. It would be too much of a coincidence for another couple with exactly the same forenames to be registered at the clinic. Ian remained sitting in his car, deep in thought, frantically searching for an explanation. Then he pressed redial on his phone. His call went straight to the Moller's answer phone, inviting him to leave a message. He didn't. He pressed redial again, with the same result. Edie Moller was there, but not answering his calls. Annoyed, Ian tucked his phone into his jacket pocket, took his briefcase from the passenger seat, and with a feeling of disquiet got out of the car. He had to go into work now. Preoccupied, he crossed the car park and went in the back entrance of Weatherby Security Limited. Then up the 2 flights of stairs to his office. Saying a perfunctory good morning to his colleagues, he sat at his desk, took out his mobile phone, and called the clinic again. As he thought might happen, it went through to answer phone. Edie Moller would see his number on the caller display. He picked up his desk phone and called the clinic from that. "Good morning. The Moller Clinic, Edie speaking. How can I help you?" "It's Ian Jennings," he said. "You're not answering my calls." A pause, then, "I'm sorry, Mr. Jennings. I really can't help you further. It's for your wife to contact us." He heard the tension in her voice and knew she was very worried about something. "I appreciate that, but I want to talk about me, not her. Do you have an Ian Jennings listed on your books with the address 57 Booth Lane?" The silence seemed to confirm they did, and Mrs. Moller was scared. "If you wish to make an inquiry about yourself, then you'll need to make an appointment," she said. "But I'm afraid we're fully booked until next year." "I'm not waiting until next year for answers," Ian said. "I want to come in today." "I'm afraid that's not possible." "We'll see about that," he said, and ended the call. Next year. He needed answers now. Edie Moller was hiding something, and he intended to find out what. Picking up his briefcase, Ian left the office, telling his boss on the way out he was working from home. "Family matter," he added, aware they wouldn't press him as the company knew his wife had suffered a late miscarriage. Ian took the stairs 2 at a time and then crossed the car park to his car. Edie Moller hadn't answered the phone when she'd seen it was his number, and when she had answered and found out it was him, she had been wary and guarded. If his details weren't on their file, then surely she would have just said that the Ian Jennings she had registered lived at a different address. But she hadn't. So why did the Moller Clinic have his details when he'd never been near the clinic? He intended to find out. Ian entered the postcode of the Moller Clinic in the car's sat-nav, and leaving the car park, joined the rush-hour traffic through Coleshaw. His thoughts were working overtime in the stop-start line of vehicles, and he agitatedly drummed his fingers on the steering wheel. What was going on? Had Emma been to the clinic without him? Surely not. They'd had no need for donated sperm. She got pregnant easily enough. It was what happened after that caused the problem. Ian shuddered at the thought. 2 pregnancies that had ended the same way. He couldn't bear the thought of another. Neither could Emma, unless they found out what was going wrong and were able to put it right. But what had the Moller Clinic got to do with that? Nothing, as far as he knew. Once out of the congested town, Ian drove as fast as the country lanes would allow, and 50 minutes later, he was parking outside the Moller Clinic. The house was set apart from the rest of the village by being situated at the top of a hill on the other side. It looked exactly like the photograph on their website, except for the CCTV cameras. They had either been added after the photograph had been taken, or not wanting to discourage clients, purposely left off the photo. Ian got out of the car and went up the front garden path that ran alongside the drive. A shiny new BMW sat on the forecourt, suggesting the Mollers were doing quite well. The brass plaque on the door to the clinic announced, "The Moller Clinic," in bold black lettering. He pressed the doorbell and heard it chime inside. A few moments later, the door opened, and Ian recognised Edie Moller from her photograph on their website, although clearly she had no idea who he was. "Good morning," she said with a bright, welcoming smile. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, I'm Ian Jennings." He watched her face change. "You'd better come in," she said, obviously unnerved by his arrival. "I'll get my husband to speak to you." "Thank you." Ian followed Edie Moller down the hall and into the waiting room, which was exactly like the picture on their website. Cream curtains, white leather sofa, and a glass-topped table with magazines and a vase of fresh flowers. "I'll tell him you're here," Edie said, and hurried out, closing the door behind her. Ian sat on the leather sofa and glanced around. Had Edie Moller already told her husband of her error, or was she telling him now? He was half expecting her to return and say her husband couldn't see him, and he'd have to make an appointment, in which case he'd stay put, and insist he saw him now. There was no one else waiting. Carsten Moller was here, and this was too important to leave. He needed answers to his questions now. Ian checked his phone. There were no new messages, and set it to silent. A few moments later, footsteps sounded in the hall. The door opened, and Edie Moller appeared. "Mr. Moller will see you now," she announced formally. "Thank you," Ian said, and stood. She led the way along the hall towards the rear of the house, where she stopped outside a door marked Office. Giving a brief knock, she opened it. "Mr. Jennings to see you." Ian went in. "Good morning, Mr. Jennings," Carsten Moller said, coming out from behind a large oak desk to shake hands. Shorter and older than he had appeared in his picture on their website, he was wearing a white lab coat over a grey open-neck shirt and dark grey trousers. "Take a seat," he said, gesticulating to the leather armchair positioned in front of his desk. As Ian sat down, Edie Moller went out and closed the door behind her. Mr. Moller returned to his chair. A row of filing cabinets filled one wall, and shelves crammed with books another. There was also a second, smaller desk with a computer and a printer where Ian assumed Edie Moller worked. "How can I help you?" Carsten Moller asked evenly, although Ian was pretty certain he already knew. "I telephoned earlier this morning to inquire about tracing my wife's sperm donor, but I discovered you also have me listed on your books." Carsten Moller nodded. "That's correct. I can discuss your request, but you'll need to bring your wife with you to discuss her search." "I know that now," Mrs. Moller said, "but the reason I'm here is to find out why you have my details. I've never been to your clinic before today." Moller held Ian's gaze. "We usually offer counselling before a client begins a search for their donor," he replied. "That's not my question. Why have you got my details?" Moller drew his hands together and took a breath. "I would have thought that was obvious, Mr. Jennings. You are on our books because you were conceived by donor sperm." "No, I wasn't." "Your reaction is exactly why we recommend counselling first," Moller replied. "I don't need counselling," Ian snapped. "Just the truth." "I am telling you the truth, Mr. Jennings. You asked me why we have your details, and I've given you an honest answer." Ian stared at him and felt his stomach loosen. "Edie Moller said it was a case of mistaken identity, but you're now telling me that isn't so." "That's right." Ian felt hot and clammy. "Are you saying my mother came here for treatment?" he asked incredulously. "That's correct, although your mother and father came together, as do most couples." "My mother received donor sperm?" Ian asked, horrified. "That's correct." "And my parents came together, so my father knew?" "Yes.
It's definitely not a mistake, then, Ian said, struggling to believe what he was being told. No, the mistake was when my wife accidentally told you over the phone that you were on our books, for which we are both sorry. It was early, and she had just come into the office. She knows she must be more careful in the future. It's obviously come as a huge shock to you. Ian stared at Molla. It has. My parents never said anything to me, ever. My father is dead, but my mother knows that I've been researching my genetic history. Why hasn't she told me? I can't answer that, but many parents don't tell their children. You'd be surprised just how many people from Coleshaw and the surrounding villages have been conceived from donated sperm and are not aware of it. It's more often the children aren't told than they are. My wife grew up knowing, Ian said ruefully. She is one of a small minority. Ian glanced distractedly around the room, then brought his gaze back to Molla. Why did you have my wife's married name and our current address? Emma's mother, Mary Holmes, telephoned the clinic and asked if her daughter had been in touch. She said you were researching their genetic history and had put pressure on Emma to contact us. She asked for some advice. We updated our records at the time in case Emma contacted us. She hasn't. She's finding it difficult, Ian admitted. That's understandable, Molla said in a conciliatory manner. It's quite a journey to search out a donor, and not one to be taken lightly. So I'm not who I thought I was, Ian said, struggling. And all my research has been a waste of time. Of course you're the same person you've always been. And as for your research, I can assure you that if there is any genetic fault, it hasn't come from this clinic. All sperm donors are thoroughly screened, so if there is a problem, it's not with your biological father. Ian let out a heartfelt sigh. I understand, he said numbly. I'm sorry you had to find out this way. I suggest you have a chat with your mother and Emma, and then contact me again if you or your wife wish to trace your donors. My advice would be not to. Why? Ian asked. Nothing will be achieved, and it could make you both feel unsettled. Emma has the right idea. Be guided by her. When we first started our clinic, no one traced their donors and everyone was happy. Then the law changed. Get on with your life, and be grateful you are both healthy, intelligent, and able to do well. You have me to thank for that, for screening your donor. Now, if there's nothing else, I really must be getting on. Thank you for coming to see me. I'll let my wife know you're ready to leave. Without waiting for a reply, Molla pressed a buzzer beneath his desk, and almost immediately Edie Molla came into the room. I'll see you out, Mr. Jennings, she said with a tight smile. Ian stood and left the room. Chapter 24. Ian got into his car but didn't start the engine. He was in no fit state to drive. While he accepted what Molla had told him, there was something about him and his wife Ian really didn't like. They were smug, dogmatic, superior. Yes, that was it. The pair of them exuded a sense of elitism, as though they knew better than others. Be grateful you are both healthy, intelligent, and able to do well. You have me to thank for that, Molla had said arrogantly. Ian supposed that playing God for so long and giving infertile clients children had gone to his head. But Ian knew he had to speak to his mother, and it wouldn't be easy. He took a swig of water from the bottle he kept in his car, and picking up his phone, pressed the number for his mother, Helen. She lived a 2-hour drive away, and he saw her a few times a year. She'd be at work now, caring for an elderly lady with dementia, but hopefully when she saw his number, she'd take his call or call him back straight away if she was busy. She answered on the third ring. "Is everything all right?" she asked with a mother's anxiety for her child, regardless of their age. "No, Mum, it's not," Ian said bluntly. "I'm parked outside the Moller Clinic. Does that name mean anything to you?" He heard his mother's silence and could visualize her face. He hated doing this to her. He loved her, but now felt cheated and betrayed. How could she have lived with this secret all these years and not told him? "Why are you there?" she finally asked, her voice slight. "Because I've just discovered that the man I used to call Dad isn't my real father, and I'm the result of donor sperm, a complete stranger you never even met. I can't believe you did this to me, Mum, and didn't tell me." "Ian, it wasn't like that," Helen said somberly. "We wanted children and tried for years, but then we had tests and discovered your father had such a low sperm count it would be impossible for me to conceive naturally. We thought long and hard about what we should do before we sought the help of the Moller Clinic. Of course your dad was your father, he loved you, but we felt it was better you didn't know." "But why not tell me now, Mum?" Ian asked, screwing shut his eyes. "You knew I was researching my genetic history so Emma and I could hopefully have a normal baby. Surely that was the time to tell me." "I thought about it, but I knew it would come as a huge shock to you after all these years. I wanted you to remember your father as he was, your dad, the man who brought you up. He loved you and was so proud of you, son. You know that, don't you?" "Yes," Ian admitted. "He was a good man. I can't fault him. But this has come as a huge shock, Mum, and straight after finding out Emma was conceived by donor sperm too." "Was she? Really?" Helen asked, surprised. "I had no idea." "Neither did I until yesterday, although she's known most of her life." "Why didn't she tell you?" "Same reasons you and Dad didn't." "I can understand that. Which clinic did her parents use, do you know?" Helen asked. "The Moller Clinic, the same as you and Dad." As Ian said this, a new fear suddenly gripped him. "Oh my God, Mum, you don't think Emma and I could share the same donor? If we did, it would mean we were related, half-brother and sister." Bile rose in his throat, and he flung open his car door just in time to throw up in the gutter. "Ian, are you okay?" his mother asked on the other end of the phone. "No," he said, wiping his mouth. He took another swig of water. "Mum, if Emma and I do have the same biological father, it might explain why we look similar and can't have healthy children. Some defects in DNA only appear if there's inbreeding." "But Carsten and Edie Moller are professionals," Helen said. "They know what they're doing. They wouldn't have let that happen, I'm certain." "Think about it, Mum. Sperm donors donate many times and can father hundreds of children. The Mollers couldn't have predicted that Emma and I would ever get together. If I'd had any idea that Emma and I were the product of donated sperm and from the same clinic, I would have checked with them before we married to make sure we weren't related. Otherwise it's incest, Mum." His stomach churned, and he swallowed back fresh bile. "No, it's not possible. I'm sure you're wrong, Ian." "How can you be so sure, Mum? You should have told me." "I'm so sorry. I kept quiet for your father's sake. I never thought it would come to this." Her voice broke. Ian was silent for a moment and then said, "I'm going back into the clinic now to confront Carsten Moller." I need to know the truth.
Chapter 25. Ian drew himself to his full height as he returned up the front path to the Moller Clinic and pressed the bell. No one answered. They were in all right, but would be able to see him on the CCTV. He pressed the bell again, long and hard, then opened the letterbox and shouted, "I know you're in there. I need to speak to you. I'm not leaving until I do." Straightening, he pressed the bell again and kept his finger on it until the door opened.
"Yes, what is it, Mr. Jennings?" Carsten Muller demanded. "You're making a hell of a noise."
Ian could see Edie Moller standing a little way behind him down the hall, her mobile in hand, probably ready to call the police if necessary. "Could Emma and I have the same sperm donor?" Ian asked.
"No, of course not."
"How can you be so certain?"
"I keep meticulous records. I always have done. We're professional. That sort of thing can't happen here."
"Have you checked your records for Emma and me?"
"No, I didn't know you were coming here today. You just turned up."
"So you can check now, please."
"It will take me a while. I can wait." "I'll phone you," Moller said, "but you're worrying unnecessarily. It's not my clinic that's at fault."
"Please check now, and I'll wait in my car for your call. I'm not leaving until I have the answer."
"That's your decision," Moller said, and closed the door.
Ian returned to his car. Arrogant bastard. He was prepared to wait outside the clinic all day if necessary. He had the right to know if he and Emma shared the same donor, horrendous though that possibility was. If the clinic was keeping proper records as Moller had said, then it shouldn't be too difficult to find the information. Ian stared, unseeing through the windscreen, angry, upset, and fearing the worst. 5 minutes later his phone rang. It was Carsten Muller.
"I have checked our records, and as I thought, you and your wife don't share the same donor." "Are you sure?" "Perfectly."
"So why can't we have healthy babies?"
"I really don't know. There could be many reasons. I'm sorry for you, but it has nothing to do with my clinic. And if you don't mind me saying, I think you're becoming obsessed with this. Take Emma's advice and get on with your lives. Now, I really need to do some work. Goodbye, Mr. Jennings." He ended the call. "Arsehole!" Ian cursed and started the car. He didn't like the man, but at least he had answered his question. He and Emma didn't share the same donor, so that was a great relief. Ian drove the 200 or so meters into the village and parked outside the shop. He hadn't smoked in years, but now felt desperately in need of a cigarette. Discovering he'd come from donor sperm had been a huge blow. He was the only customer in the store, and a teenage lad was behind the counter listening to music. He took out his earphones as Ian approached. "A packet of Marlboro, please." The lad opened the cabinet behind him and placed the cigarettes on the counter. The printed warning on the packet face up, "Smoking reduces fertility." "That's all I need," Ian sighed, taking out his wallet. The lad grinned. "You been to that clinic on the hill, then?" he asked. "Yes. How did you know?" "Most strangers who come in have been or are going there. £11.50, please." Jesus. Is that what a packet of cigarettes costs now? Just shows how long it's been since I last smoked. He gave the lad a £20 note and waited for his change. "What did you think of Mr. and Mrs. Frankenstein, then?" The lad laughed. Ian shrugged. "Why do you call them that?" "Mum says I shouldn't, but you've got to admit they're a bit weird." "Do you know them well, then?" "No. They don't come in here much and don't really associate with us in the village. So why do you call them Mr. and Mrs. Frankenstein? Ian asked, tucking the cigarettes into his pocket. They make babies, don't they? And there are rumours around here they create monsters. The lad laughed again. What do you mean? Ian asked, with a stab of unease. Oh, nothing, he shrugged. Mum says I shouldn't repeat this stuff, but rumour has it that sometimes things go wrong and the babies aren't born right. Ian took his receipt and left the store. The babies he and Emma had produced weren't right, not by a long way. But they hadn't used sperm from the Moller clinic, so they couldn't blame the clinic for creating their monsters. Unless Moller had made a mistake or lied, and he and Emma did share the same donor sperm. Then the chance of a genetic fault being passed on became possible again. Chapter 26. You're home early, Emma said as Ian came into the living room. Without replying, he threw his briefcase and jacket over the armchair and continued to the table where he opened his laptop. What's the matter? Emma asked, concerned. You've been smoking. I can smell it on your clothes. Shouldn't you be at work? Yes, but I need to find out how to do a DNA test, he said, staring at his laptop screen. Not that again, Emma sighed. I've told you I'll phone the clinic, but I have to be in the right mood. There's no need to phone now. I spoke to them this morning. In fact, I've been there. You've been to the Moller clinic? Emma asked, amazed, looking at him. Why? It turns out it's not just you, but me too. What are you talking about? You're not making any sense, Ian. She closed the book she'd been reading and put it to one side. I'm the product of donor sperm just like you, he said, tapping the laptop. From the same clinic. Emma stared at him. What? How can that be? Ian didn't reply, but concentrated on the screen. Ian, I'm talking to you. Can you tell me what's going on? You're frightening me. Ian paused to look at her. I phoned the Moller clinic this morning about tracing your donor and spoke to Eddie Moller. She let slip that I was on their files too. I saw Moller himself and he said both our parents used their clinic. I called my mother and she confirmed that she and Dad had gone there. Struth, that's a coincidence. And your mum never told you? Nope, not a word. Oh, I am sorry, Ian. I can see how upset you are. It must have come as a huge shock to find out like that. She went over to give him a hug, but his attention was already on the laptop again. You can see now why my mother told me early on, Emma said. It wasn't a shock for me. I grew up knowing I came from donor sperm. Ian nodded. What are you doing now? Trying to find out how to get our DNA tested. Testing is far more sophisticated now than it was when we were conceived, so it may show up something that wasn't picked up before. Also, he hesitated. Did she have to know this? Yes, she did. We're nearly the same age, so I'm guessing our parents must have used the clinic quite close together. I need to confirm we don't have the same donor. What? You mean there's a chance we may have... Emma stared at him, horrified. Not according to Carsten Moller, but I want to check. If, heaven forbid, we do have the same donor, it could explain why we can't have healthy babies. But Mr. Moller told you we didn't, Emma said. Yes. Well, he's not likely to have made a mistake with something so important. He may have, and now he's lying to cover his back, Ian said, concentrating on the screen. Emma stared at him incredulously. You think that's possible? But Ian was still engrossed in what he was doing. Here's what we need, he said, tapping the keys. Websites offering DNA tests. This one looks good. mygenetichistory.com. 60 quid each. They send us the kit to take samples of our saliva. The results are back in 3 working days. Perfect. Can you pass me my wallet, love? It's in my jacket pocket. If I order now, we should have the kits at the weekend. And then what happens? Emma asked. Will you be satisfied, or will you not believe them either? I'm sure you're wrong, Ian. This is all taking over. Here's your wallet. I'm going for a shower. Chapter 27. Jan wasn't nervous about living in the cottage, as Chris had said, she told herself. His comments the evening before were still annoying her, together with his behaviour. First at the restaurant, and then denying he'd seen a figure running from the cottage. She still had no idea what had got into him, but today she was going to prove him wrong and show she wasn't nervous by taking Tinder for a walk in Coleshaw Woods. D.S. Matt Davis had said how lovely the woods were at this time of year, and that she was missing out. So now, empowered by hurt pride and daylight, she was going. Not wholly at ease with her decision, but determined to give her confidence another small boost, Jan tucked her phone and keys into her jacket pocket, and with Tinder beside her, tail wagging, she left the cottage. She set off along Wood Lane in the direction of Merryless. It was midday, and the wintry November sun was as high in the sky as it would get, flickering through the bare branches of the trees she passed. A good walk should also clear her head, she thought. After all the wine she'd drunk the night before. The evening had held such promise, but had turned into a disaster. Oh well, another one bites the dust, she thought stoically. Pleased to be off the lead, Tinder ran on ahead, then stopped every so often to look behind him and wait for Jan to catch up. Part-way down Wood Lane was the turning on the right that led into the deepest part of Coleshaw Woods that ran behind the cottage. Jan had never ventured down it before, although Tinder often glanced longingly towards it as they passed on their way to the village. Jan didn't know if Camille ever walked him there. She hadn't told her. Her instructions had said that Tinder should be let out in the garden 3 times a day, and to take him with her when she walked to Merryless, but not to take him in the car as he got travel-sick. Jan had only used her car twice since arriving, and it was parked on a concrete stand to the right of the cottage, now covered in leaves. "Come on, this way, Tinder," Jan called. He'd gone past the turning. He stopped, looked back, and, unable to believe his good luck, ran full tilt towards her. "Come on, you softy. We're going to walk in the woods today." She ruffled his fur, and they began along the track. Jan knew from reading about Coleshaw Woods that most visitors came in summer and entered through the road on the other side of the woods, where there was a car park, picnic area, and signposted walks. There was also a flooded quarry where anglers fished. The woods on this side were at their thickest, and although there were tracks like the one she was on, they were rarely used. But if she kept to it, she shouldn't get lost, and even if she did, she had her phone with her so she could call for help. Despite the reassurances she'd given herself, it wasn't long before Jan began to feel slightly anxious by the complete isolation. It was eerie to be so alone. She'd spent all her life in towns and cities where you were never alone, even at night or in parks. Now there was just her, Tinder, and the occasional rustle of woodland life in the undergrowth. Digging her hands deeper into her jacket pockets, Jan continued resolutely along the track. The air was certainly fresh enough to get rid of her hangover, she thought. Yet there was also a pungent, damp smell that you didn't get in Wood Lane, which Jan supposed was caused by the fallen, rotting leaves. Tinder didn't seem to mind. His short legs were disappearing into the mulch as he sniffed around, and pieces of leaves and twigs stuck to his fur. But although he didn't mind the litter fall sticking to his coat, Jan noticed he was keeping very close to her. He seemed apprehensive, and she supposed it was because he was in unfamiliar territory. While it was somewhat creepy being all alone, Jan reminded herself that nature wouldn't harm her. She wasn't sure how far the track went, nor where the cottage lay in relation to it. She knew it would be on her right, but that was all. A few moments later, she made a snap decision to try to find the cottage. Leaving the track, she turned right, further into the forest. Tinder stayed close, and their pace slowed as the piles of rotting leaves deepened. In some places, there were such small gaps between the trees that she had to step around them and part bracken and ivy to forge a path. There was no sign of anyone else having ever been here. Every so often, Jan paused to look behind her to check she was walking in a straight line, so she would know how to get back to the track. It was disorientating being surrounded by so many tall trees. There was no horizon or landmark from which she could take her bearings, but she was as sure as she could be that she was heading in the right direction to where she hoped the cottage lay. The air was still and chilly here. A few minutes later, she was rewarded as the boundary hedge at the bottom of the cottage garden appeared between the trees. She made her way up to it and then found the gap in the hedge with her repair work visible on the other side, the criss-crossing pieces of wood still blocking the hole. It appeared to be standing up well, she thought. She looked around. This was the spot where whatever it was had been getting in, though there was nothing to be seen now but more leaves and twigs. Nothing to suggest anyone or anything had been here. How brave she was in daylight, she thought, but best not overdo it. She turned away from the hedge, ready to retrace her steps. She'd accomplished what she'd intended to do, and her confidence had grown by coming into the deepest part of the forest. She'd also been able to check the boundary fence. "Come on, Tinder, time to go," she called. Her voice sounded strange and far off in the otherwise quiet forest. He was a little way to her left, having picked up the scent of something. He was sniffing around the base of a tree close to the hedge. "What is it?" She went over. A ball of green twine, just like the ones Camille kept in the shed, and which Jan had used to tie the wood in place, lay partly covered by leaves. Moving Tinder aside, Jan picked it up and examined it. She was sure it had come from Camille's shed. But what was it doing here? Had Chris or Camille used it for repairing the fence in the past? No. Chris would have used something stronger and more robust, hammer and nails, not twine, she was sure. And Camille had been gone weeks. This ball of twine hadn't been here long. It was barely wet and showed no sign of weathering. Days, not weeks, she thought. Tinder was looking at her expectantly, hoping to get another sniff of the ball, but Jan threw it in the direction of her back garden. If it made it in there, she would return it to the shed. She set off towards the track, Tinder at her heels. If she walked in a straight line, she should come out more or less where she'd come off the track. Then it was left towards Wood Lane. As she walked, the only sound came from her boots crunching over the dry leaves and twigs, and Tinder running beside her. In some places, she could see the footmarks she and Tinder had made on their way in, so she knew she was on the right course. Suddenly, Tinder stopped and gave a low growl. His ears pricked up. He had heard something. Pausing, Jan looked in the same direction, but there was nothing to be seen. "Come on, good boy, this way," she said, her voice slightly unsteady. He gave another growl but came with her. A few steps further on, she heard a noise coming from the same direction, as though someone else was here. Cold fear embraced her. It was still some way back to the track, and even further to Wood Lane and the cottage. Her heart began to race.
It had been stupid to come this far into the woods alone, just to prove a point. Who knew what lived here? She began to run, stumbling over the piles of rotten leaves and bracken while trying to avoid the branches overhead. Tinder ran beside her, as eager to be out of the woods as she was. Thankfully, the trees cleared, and she found herself on the track again, but the movement in the wood continued. Someone or something was in there, moving parallel to them. Petrified, Jan quickened her pace and took out her phone, ready to call for help if necessary. She stopped and stared in disbelief, as a little further up, Chris and a woman stepped from the woods onto the track. It must have been them she'd heard. She took a deep breath and tried to calm her racing heart as Tinder ran to Chris. Dressed similarly in boots and wax jackets, they continued towards her. "Fancy seeing you here," Chris said stiffly, and bent to ruffle Tinder's fur. "I didn't think you liked the woods." "I thought it was time to get over that," Jan said, equally as awkward. "This is my friend Anne," Chris said, introducing his companion. "Anne, Camille's lodger, Jan." "Hello, pleased to meet you," Anne said, but her expression said something different. Jan saw Chris looking at her. Guilt? Embarrassment? She wasn't sure. There was an awkward silence, and then he said, "Oh well, we'll let you get on with your walk. Are you heading back to the cottage now?" "Yes. Why?" Jan asked. "I just wondered." "Bye then." "Bye," Jan replied. She continued along the track towards Wood Lane, in the opposite direction to Chris and Anne. She didn't look back. How embarrassing was that? And what were they doing in the woods near the back of the cottage? Chris had offered no explanation, and Jan certainly wouldn't phone or text to ask him. She felt a pang of jealousy but dismissed it. Clearly he preferred older women, for Anne must be 50. Homely, mumsy described her, Jan thought. Slightly overweight with a practical chin-length hairstyle and no makeup. Jan wondered if Anne knew Chris had taken her out the evening before. It would explain the look she'd given her.